They captured a sitting president but didn't kill him. They didn't exile him. They made him speak on live television. And what he said changed everything. This wasn't just a coup, it was a confession. And it happened not in some far-off dystopia, but in Ivory Coast, a place where the people were no longer afraid, where silence itself became political, where truth was forced into the spotlight and a nation watched with bated breath. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had warned Africa months earlier. The puppets will fall, but the puppeteers must be seen. On that day, both were exposed, and history didn't look away. If you still believe that a small nation can stand tall against the weight of global powers, if you still believe that Africa deserves to write its own story in its own voice on its own terms, if you've ever seen the fire burning in Captain Traoré's eyes and felt it echo in your soul, then this story is also yours. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, not just to support, but to walk alongside a rising tide. A tide of truth, of awakening, of reclaiming what was once quietly taken. This is more than a broadcast, it's a movement, because the whispers have grown louder, and now they've become a silent storm. But this wasn't just a power vacuum, it was a challenge to an entire system. On the second day after the fall, the world watched in confusion as no emergency government was declared, no interim president stepped forward, no blood ran through the streets. What kind of coup doesn't take the palace by storm? What kind of general doesn't demand the title of head of state? The answer came in silence. General Sekou Doumbia didn't seek control, he sought clarity. And his first act was not to command, but to confront. He ordered no executions, no trials. Instead, he made a single quiet demand: let the truth be spoken by the very man who had once ruled with silence. President Alassane Ouattara was alive. That alone shocked the world. Seated in a guarded room, wearing no uniform, stripped of all ceremony, he was no longer a symbol of power. He was the evidence of what had been hidden, of what had been sold, of what had been lost. And behind the calm exterior of his captor stood a deeper presence, an idea carried across the Sahel, from Ouagadougou to Abidjan. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's warning, that the puppets will fall, but the puppeteers must be seen. Doumbia was listening. He wasn't copying a revolution, he was continuing one. This wasn't just the toppling of a regime, it was the beginning of an investigation, live televised and irreversible. Ivory Coast wasn't asking for blood, it was asking for testimony. A former president was given a pen, a statement, and a choice: to speak as a free man, or to remain silent as history changed without him. And then the unexpected happened. 8 days into silence, under the weight of shame, isolation, and a continent watching, President Alassane Ouattara did what no one believed he would. He spoke. No fanfare, no flags, no prepared speech blessed by diplomats or spin doctors. Just a man in a gray jacket, seated alone before a camera facing his nation. The broadcast had no state seal, no anthem, no applause. Only words, raw, unpolished, and devastating. I speak today not as a president, he began, but as a son of this soil who lost his way. The words dropped like thunder over West Africa. In living rooms and cafes from Abidjan to Dakar, people fell silent. What followed was not just a confession. It was an autopsy of a system hidden behind handshakes and photo ops. Ouattara admitted that under his leadership, Ivory Coast had not governed itself, it had been managed. By embassies, by creditors, by foreign oil and mining contracts signed behind closed doors. He named them: French multinationals, European consultants, Western intelligence officers advising on which activists to imprison and which protests to suppress. He spoke of trade deals that benefited elites, of IMF conditions disguised as partnerships, of military access agreements that turned Ivorian bases into quiet extensions of European power. There was no spin, no blame, just ownership. And in that moment, something shifted. The camera wasn't capturing a fallen dictator, it was witnessing the death of denial. The illusion that post-colonial governance was neutral, that foreign assistance was benign, that African sovereignty was intact. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had once warned, "The real fight is not for the palace, it's for the narrative." Those words echoed through every syllable of Ouattara's confession. This wasn't a speech. It was a surrender, not of a country, but of a lie. In classrooms across the continent, professors paused their lectures. In mosques and churches, sermons changed. Activists printed transcripts and handed them out on street corners. Political podcasts dissected each paragraph. On social media, the phrase, "break the script," began trending. And in the heart of the Sahel, Captain Traoré's name was invoked not as a rebel, but as a prophet. His message, once dismissed as radical, now felt prophetic. This was not about replacing leaders. It was about exposing systems. But the most haunting moment came near the end of the broadcast. Ouattara looked directly into the lens and said, "To the youth of Africa, we did not fight for independence to become administrators of a foreign-designed script. We failed you, but you must not fail yourselves." He didn't cry. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't beg for clemency. He simply told the truth. And in doing so, he gave up everything he had spent decades building, not for redemption, but for relevance. Because for once, a fallen African leader did not die in denial or exile. He stayed, he spoke, and he exposed. In the aftermath, the West scrambled. Paris issued vague statements about post-crisis stability. Washington praised Ouattara's service, but they never mentioned the speech. Not once. Because to acknowledge it would be to acknowledge the entire structure behind him. And that structure was cracking. What Captain Ibrahim Traoré had ignited in Burkina Faso, a rebellion not just of weapons, but of words, was now sweeping across borders. This was not a coup, it was an awakening, and the man who had once ruled with silence had become its first witness. And what came next was not a reaction, it was a ripple. President Ouattara's televised confession didn't stay within Ivory Coast. It detonated across Africa like a slow-moving explosion. In Senegal, students gathered outside the National Assembly, holding handwritten signs that read, "If Ouattara can admit it, so can Macky." In Gabon, anonymous officials began leaking old state contracts, unearthing deals made in silence. In Chad, a military colonel posted just one word on social media: respect. That single word from a soldier in uniform carried more force than an entire press release. This wasn't a regional story anymore. It was continental. And it wasn't about one fallen man. It was about every man who had ever ruled from a script not his own. Ouattara had broken something far older than his presidency. He had torn through the veil of stability, a word often used by the West to justify silent partnerships, invisible pressures, and economic strings dressed up as development aid, and the people saw it for what it was. In Mali, public forums were flooded with citizens demanding to see their nation's mining contracts. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, young journalists began publishing side-by-side comparisons of Chinese and European deals, asking who truly benefited. In Dakar University, professors who had long avoided politics rewrote their curricula mid-semester to include a new section, post-colonial puppetry. Suddenly, every classroom became a war room, every street corner a tribunal of public opinion. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's prophecy had come to life. Months earlier, he had declared, "Africa does not need more rulers. It needs more witnesses." Now millions had become witnesses, not to another coup, but to the machinery behind those coups. It was no longer just a question of who ruled, but who ruled through them. The phrase, "break the script," began trending across African social platforms. But it wasn't just a slogan, it was a call to audit. A call to question not only leadership, but legislation. Why were security forces still trained abroad? Why were foreign embassies dictating election standards? Why were contracts signed in French, but not translated for the people? At the African Union Summit, tensions erupted. Some leaders praised Dumbia's nonviolent transition, and his commitment to a civilian-led future. Others, those long tethered to Paris, Brussels, or Washington, warned that the Ou.at.ta.ra precedent was dangerous, that it could unravel decades of quiet diplomacy and bring instability. But outside the marble halls and manicured gardens, ordinary Africans weren't debating, they were deciding. In Abidjan, hundreds of citizens sat silently outside the RTI building for days, holding signs that read, "Let us hear the truth." In mosques, imams invoked the confession during Friday prayers. In churches, pastors spoke of repentance not just for sins, but for systems. Even refugee camps in the Sahel found makeshift screens to rebroadcast the speech. And then came the diaspora. In Paris, young Africans born in France, but never fully accepted as French, held public readings of the confession outside the National Assembly. In Brussels, they hosted panel discussions titled, "The Day the Script Broke." In Montreal, activists screened the video in community centers packed to capacity. Across oceans and time zones, the feeling was the same: someone had finally said it. And not just someone, a president, on camera, voluntarily. That's what terrified the old powers the most. It wasn't the content of the speech, it was its consent. There were no handcuffs, no bruises, no coerced tears. Just a man alone saying what every African had suspected for years. And by speaking, he made silence impossible for everyone else. Back in Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré addressed his people during a modest press conference. He didn't celebrate Ouattara's fall. He didn't praise Doumbia by name. He simply said, "When one man breaks the silence, many more will hear the sound." It was a warning and a welcome. Because what had begun in Ouagadougou as a lone voice calling for sovereignty had become something far greater. It had become language, movement, fire. The old guard feared guns, but they feared clarity more, because clarity is contagious. And in a continent long told to be patient, to wait, to obey, the truth had just gone viral. And yet, even as the truth rippled across the continent, what happened next was not vengeance, it was design. General Sekou Doumbia didn't seize the throne. He didn't parade tanks through the streets. He didn't even deliver a triumphant address from the presidential palace. Instead, he stepped back. What Ivory Coast needed now wasn't a new ruler. It needed a new reality. The people, not a strongman, would shape what came after. And so, under Doumbia's leadership, a national process was launched, the People's Constitutional Assembly. It wasn't just symbolic, it was revolutionary. Farmers from Koro, students from Bouaké, women from Abidjan, fishermen from Grand Bassam, teachers, engineers, even repatriated diaspora members, every voice was welcomed. This wasn't a committee chosen by elites. It was a chorus assembled by the people. The meetings were live-streamed, transcribed, and held in schools, stadiums, parks, and markets. For the first time, sovereignty was not a slogan. It was a civic exercise. At the center of this new movement stood one haunting question. How do we guarantee sovereignty, not just in name, but in practice? Proposals came flooding in. Ban all foreign military bases, unless approved by public referendum. Outlaw campaign donations from foreign governments or corporations. Introduce mandatory civic education on neo-colonialism and economic self-determination. Publish a quarterly sovereignty index to measure how much of Ivory Coast's food, energy, water, and health care was actually controlled by Ivorians. This wasn't a wish list. It was a blueprint. And every clause, every amendment carried the weight of what had just been confessed by the man who once sat at the top. Alassane Ouattara's televised admission became more than a political reckoning, it became the moral spine of the new constitution. One 24-year-old woman stood at a microphone in the Central Assembly Hall and said, "We don't want to burn the bridge. We just want to be the ones who decide where it leads." Her words drew applause not only in that room, but across the airwaves. That sentence, humble, firm, unshakable, summed up the mood of a nation, not isolation, not retaliation, redirection. But the most daring proposal came when the Assembly addressed the very structure of leadership. No more singular presidency. No man or woman would hold sole power again. Instead, a rotating executive council of 5 would govern elected proportionally from 5 regions. No member could serve more than a single 4-year term. Emergency powers would no longer be held by individuals, but by citizen assemblies. It was unheard of. For Western observers, radical. For Ivorians, reparative. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had once said, "Africa doesn't suffer from lack of vision, it suffers from visions imposed." What Ivory Coast was doing now wasn't creating chaos, it was reclaiming authorship. The script was being rewritten, not by diplomats, not by generals, but by citizens who had refused to look away when the truth was finally spoken. And what of Doumbia? He declined to run. He stepped down from interim leadership, quietly, with no farewell parade. He returned to his modest home in northern Côte d'Ivoire. When asked by a journalist if he had any regrets, he said, "I was not the revolution. I was just the man who refused to pretend any longer." As for Ou.at.ta.ra, he remained. Not exiled, not jailed, not disgraced. Just present. No longer in power, but not erased. When the new government invited him to testify before the Sovereignty Commission, he agreed. He arrived without security, without notes, and he spoke again, not as a defendant, but as a citizen who chose to walk through history, not hide from it. The final shock was not a military strike. It was a peaceful vote. 6 months after the confession, Ivory Coast held its first truly sovereign election. No foreign consultants, no European observers, only African civic coalitions and diaspora monitors. Voter turnout surged. No guns at polling stations, no military presence, just families standing in line quietly reclaiming what had once been outsourced, their future. The winning coalition was not a party. It was a principal structural reform, economic dignity, and the end of foreign dependency. Their platform echoed Captain Ibrahim Traoré's words, "Sovereignty is not what you declare, it's what you build." Across Africa, the message was clear. Coups may take power, but only the people can build a nation. And for the first time in generations, Ivory Coast had not just broken the chains. It had melted them down and cast something new. What began as a quiet rupture in the early morning hours of a coup would go on to redefine an entire continent's understanding of power, truth, and possibility. Ivory Coast did not simply remove a president. It rewrote the choreography of how nations confront their past. And it did so not with spectacle, but with restraint. Not with fire, but with clarity. General Sékou Doumbia never asked for devotion. He demanded accountability. He did not raise a flag for himself. He lowered one that no longer served the people. And when given the chance to crown himself, he stepped aside. In doing so, he gave the world something it was not prepared for: a military that gave power back, rather than clung to it. In a world accustomed to cynical strongmen and hollow transitions, Ivory Coast delivered a bloodless reset, anchored in a televised confession, reinforced by public participation, and protected by an army that remembered its oath. But the legacy of this moment stretches far beyond Abidjan. From refugee camps in Niger to universities in Kinshasa, the confession of President Ouattara became required viewing, not because of the man, but because of what he represented. For the first time in post-independence history, an African head of state publicly acknowledged that sovereignty had been compromised not through conquest, but through compliance, and he did so willingly. It was not perfect, it was not clean, but it was real. And in an age where authenticity is often manufactured, that truth hit harder than any policy paper or diplomatic cable. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had long warned that Africa's danger was not its poverty, but its pretense. "We are not poor," he said. "We are managed, and the difference is deadly." His words, once dismissed as populist bravado, now served as the compass for a new generation of African thinkers, reformers, and builders. Ivory Coast had demonstrated that true independence is not just about who holds the seat of power, but about who writes the story that seat belongs to. The people had reclaimed authorship, and that act alone shook the foundations of a post-colonial structure too long left unchallenged. Across Africa, something quiet but powerful was taking root. The silence that once smothered critique was being replaced by forums, classrooms, podcasts, and parliaments, alive with questions once considered taboo. Who funds our elections? Who trains our police? Who benefits from our resources? And most importantly, who are we when we are not being spoken for? Even the diaspora awakened. In cities like Paris, Brussels, Toronto, and Johannesburg, young Africans gathered to dissect debate and declare their allegiance not to any flag or faction, but to the principle of transparent governance. They organized conferences titled "The Day the Script Broke," held film screenings of the speech, and launched civic literacy campaigns in multiple languages. Ivory Coast's story had become theirs too, because in every corner of the Black world, the struggle to own the future begins with understanding how it was stolen in the first place. And yet perhaps the most enduring image of this story is not a general with medals or a president behind bars. It is a classroom. A small one tucked in the hills outside Yamoussoukro, where a teacher paused mid-lesson and rewrote the chalkboard with just 5 words. "We are writing it now." The students stared at the sentence for a moment before one raised his hand and asked, "Does that mean we're free?" The teacher didn't answer immediately. He simply smiled and said, "It means we've started." That is what Ivory Coast has offered the world, not a finished revolution, but an open door. Not perfection, but participation. It dared to strip power of its costume and let it speak in its own naked voice. And in doing so, it reminded all of us that history isn't something we inherit. It's something we author, every day, in every decision, with every truth told, even when it hurts. So the world watched, expecting collapse, expecting chaos, expecting failure. What it witnessed instead was something far more dangerous to the old order, a nation choosing to grow up. And once a people begin to write their own story, no empire can erase the ink. If you still believe that a small nation can stand tall in the face of global powers, if you believe Africa deserves to write its own story, not in borrowed tongues, but in its own voice on its own terms, if you've seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes and felt it stir something deep within you, then this story belongs to you too. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, not for applause, not for numbers, but to walk together through a rising tide, a wave of awakening of truth, long buried of sovereignty, reclaimed one voice at a time, because the whispers have become a storm. A quiet revolution is unfolding, and if you're watching this, you are already part of it. The story of Ivory Coast's silent revolution offers a profound and lasting lesson about the nature of power, truth, and responsibility in post-colonial Africa. It was not simply the toppling of a regime or the confession of a fallen president that changed the course of history. It was the way a nation chose to respond to its wounds. This was not a tale of revenge. It was not a parade of punishment. It was at its heart a collective reckoning with the system's contracts and compromises that had shaped a country's destiny without the people's consent. And in choosing to confront that truth rather than hide it, Ivory Coast taught the world that healing begins not with silence, but with honesty. One of the clearest lessons from this story is that real sovereignty cannot be given, it must be reclaimed. For decades, African states have been told that independence was achieved when flags were changed and national anthems rewritten, but the structures of dependency remained. Economic policies, trade agreements, military partnerships, and foreign aid packages continued to dictate domestic governance. What happened in Ivory Coast exposed this uncomfortable reality. The chains were no longer visible, but they were still intact. President Ouattara's public confession confirmed what millions suspected, but rarely heard aloud, that governance was managed from abroad, and loyalty was often traded for loans, favors, and silence. This moment also underscored the immense power of narrative. The West has long dominated the African story, shaping the language of diplomacy, development, and democracy through its own lens. What the world witnessed in the broadcast from Abidjan was a radical shift in authorship. For the first time in modern African history, a head of state voluntarily admitted to serving foreign interests and did so on camera. This act, however painful, returned narrative control to the people. It validated the anger, questions, and suspicions that had long been dismissed as conspiracy or populism. And it showed that even a whispered truth, when spoken publicly, can unravel decades of deception. General Sekou Doumbia's restraint taught another powerful lesson, that strength lies not in domination